I still remember the exact moment I realized the foundation of my reality had cracked, even though I didn't yet possess the vocabulary to articulate the fracture. It was a Sunday afternoon, suffocatingly quiet in that heavy, distinctly suburban way where even the dust motes seemed to drift in slow motion. My mother had gone out to run a litany of errands, grocery shopping, picking up dry cleaning, browsing the garden center, which invariably meant she would be gone for hours, lost in the sprawling aisles of big box stores. The house always felt entirely too vast without her frenetic energy filling the rooms. It was just me and my stepdad, Daniel. I was sitting at the sprawling granite island in the kitchen, half-heartedly scrolling through social media on my phone, putting on an elaborate performance of studying for a comparative literature midterm I was woefully unprepared for. Daniel was anchored in the living room, watching some Sunday football broadcast with the volume dialed down to a low, indistinct murmur, a bottle of pale ale sweating profusely in his relaxed grip. There was absolutely nothing unusual about this tableau. This was the comforting, predictable rhythm of our lives, a dynamic that had been carved out and solidified over years. Daniel had been a fixture in my life since I was 12 years old. My biological father had walked out when I was 9, disappearing into another state, embedding himself into another family, and adopting an entirely new version of himself that had no room for me. Daniel had stepped into that cavernous void quietly, cautiously, like a man who knew he was walking on hallowed ground. He never tried to aggressively replace the man who had left, but he also refused to be a passive, invisible ghost in our home. He never forced the dad title on me. I called him Daniel from day one, and he never corrected me. But as the years bled into one another, he became the steady, unwavering pillar in my chaotic adolescent world. He was the guy who showed up an hour early to my high school graduation to secure the best camera angle, the one who spent an entire Saturday covered in grease fixing the alternator on my beat up Honda Civic, and the one who sat up with me at 2 in the morning in the kitchen, brewing chamomile tea when I suffered through blinding panic attacks during finals week. He was the kind of man the neighbors pointed to with a nod of respect, universally acknowledging him as a genuinely good, reliable guy. And for the longest time I believed that narrative implicitly. That particular afternoon, the illusion began to unravel when he called out to me from the sunken living room. "Hey, can you come in here for a second?" His tone wasn't colored with anything strange or urgent. It was perfectly casual, utterly normal. I didn't think twice. I set my phone face down on the granite, slid off the bar stool, and padded into the living room, leaning comfortably against the doorframe. "Yeah, what is up?" He pressed a button on the remote, muting the television entirely, and turned his torso slightly toward me. A soft, familiar smile played on his lips. "Come sit down." Something microscopic in the atmosphere shifted, causing me to hesitate for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a jarring enough sensation to make me actively question his request, but it was just enough of a primal instinctual pause that, looking back on it now, I desperately wish I had listened to the warning bells ringing in my subconscious. I walked over and lowered myself onto the edge of the leather sectional, intentionally leaving a wide expanse of empty cushion between us. He studied me for a long, silent moment. It wasn't a glaringly creepy stare, at least not in an obvious predatory way. It felt more contemplative, heavy with unsaid words, as if he were trying to find the perfect articulation for something deeply important. "You've grown up a lot," he said, his voice dropping a register. I let out a short, dismissive laugh, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "Yeah, well, the passage of time tends to do that to a person." "I mean it," he added, the playful edge vanishing from his tone, replaced by something much softer. "You are really not a kid anymore." There was an underlying texture to his voice that I couldn't quite decipher. Was it paternal pride? Or was it something entirely different, something vastly heavier? "Okay," I said, dragging the word out slowly, the first tendrils of awkwardness beginning to coil in my stomach. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his beer, his eyes never leaving my face. "You've got your own life now. College, your friends, All these plans. You don't really need us the same way you used to. That is not true, I countered automatically, the defensive reflex kicking in. I still live here, don't I? He smiled again. But this time the warmth failed to reach the corners of his eyes. It was a hollow expression. You know what I mean. I shifted my weight on the leather, feeling increasingly uncomfortable for reasons my brain was aggressively refusing to process. Where exactly is this conversation going, Daniel? He leaned back heavily into the cushions, exhaling a long, slow breath as if he had been physically holding it in for a decade. I've just been thinking, he murmured, about the nature of time, about how terrifyingly fast things change without you even noticing. I nodded slowly, completely unmoored. Having no idea how to navigate this sudden plunge into philosophical melancholy. When you first moved into this house with your mom, he continued, his gaze drifting momentarily to the muted television screen before snapping back to me. You were this incredibly shy, fragile little thing. You wouldn't even look me in the eye when I spoke to you. I smirked, trying desperately to inject some levity back into the room. I was 12, and you were a stranger, dating my mom. Cut me some slack. Yeah, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And now, look at you. There it was again, that look. It lingered on me just a fraction of a second too long, crossing an invisible boundary that had stood firmly in place for nearly a decade. My stomach instantly tied itself into a tight, cold knot. Okay, seriously, I said. My voice pitched a little higher than normal as I tried to maintain a light-hearted facade. You are starting to sound really weird right now. He let out a low chuckle, but the sound was brittle and forced. Sorry, I really don't mean to. A suffocating silence stretched taut between us. The muted television flickered relentlessly in the background, a chaotic montage of football players colliding in slow, completely soundless motion. Then, he said it. Do you ever feel like there are things you desperately wanted in your life, but you just never got them? I blinked, genuinely thrown by the sudden pivot. What? In life, he clarified, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. Like you stood by and completely missed your chance. I offered a half-hearted shrug, wrapping my arms defensively around my own torso. I mean, I am 21. I don't exactly think I've had the time to miss out on that much yet. He let out another quiet, hollow laugh. Yeah, you've got plenty of time. Something about the defeated cadence of that sentence made my chest feel impossibly tight. And what about you? I asked, a question born entirely out of a desperate need to fill the suffocating silence. What did you miss out on? He didn't answer right away. He didn't look at the floor, or the television, or his beer. He just looked directly at me, and this time there was absolutely no mistaking the nature of his gaze. The way his eyes slowly tracked over the contours of my face, traveled deliberately down the line of my neck, and then slowly traced back up to meet my eyes. It wasn't fatherly, it wasn't even benignly neutral, it was something entirely alien to the man I thought I knew. It was a look that made the skin on the back of my arms prickle and crawl long before my conscious mind could catch up and categorize the threat. I don't know, he said finally, his voice vibrating at a low, intimate frequency. A lot of things. I stood up. It wasn't a dramatic, sweeping motion. I didn't storm out of the room or raise my voice in righteous indignation. I simply stood, suddenly and acutely aware of exactly how close we were sitting, how profoundly quiet the entire house felt, and how utterly alone we were. I really should get back to studying, I said, my voice sounding detached, like it belonged to someone else. He nodded slowly, his eyes still tracking my movements. Yeah, of course. I turned on my heel and walked out of the living room, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, uneven rhythm. I spent the rest of the afternoon frantically gaslighting myself. I paced my bedroom floor, telling myself I was overanalyzing the situation, that I was projecting, that Daniel was just being uncharacteristically reflective. Perhaps a little buzzed from the beer, a little melancholy about aging. But on a cellular level, I knew something had irrevocably shifted, and no amount of rationalization could unfeel the weight of that look. That night, I stayed barricaded in my room much longer than usual. I flipped the heavy deadbolt on my door, turned my ambient playlist on low, and sat on my bed trying to drown out the profound silence of the house. I kept mentally hitting rewind, replaying the entire conversation in my head, dissecting every syllable, every pause, every shift in his posture. It defied logic. Daniel simply wasn't that kind of man. He had never displayed even a hint of inappropriate behavior. So why did I feel this overwhelming sensation that something dark and heavy had been simmering just beneath the surface of our daily lives? A current I had been too blind, or perhaps too comfortably ignorant, to notice. A few days marched by, and the household routine nominally reset to normal. Or at the very least, a convincing pantomime of normal. He didn't make any more strange, cryptic comments. He maintained a respectful physical distance and acted as though that Sunday afternoon conversation had simply never occurred. Ironically, his seamless return to normalcy only made my anxiety worse. Because the veil had been lifted, and now I was vigilant, analyzing every micro-interaction. I noticed the way he would suddenly find a reason to linger by the coffee maker if I was in the kitchen prepping a meal. I caught the way his eyes would inadvertently dart toward me when he thought I wasn't looking, only to snap away the second I turned my head. I heard the subtle shifts in his tone when he addressed me. Softer, overly careful, laden with an unspoken weight. I began actively orchestrating my life to avoid him without making the evasion painfully obvious. I timed my meals for when he was in the garage, stayed out at the campus library until I knew he was asleep, and kept our mandatory passing conversations brutally brief and strictly logistical. For a little while, the strategy held. Until the letter arrived. It materialized on a damp Thursday afternoon, unassumingly tucked between a stack of utility bills and junk mail on the kitchen island. My name was inscribed on the front of a pristine white envelope, in a slanted architectural handwriting I would recognize anywhere. It was Daniel's the second my eyes registered the script. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. It wasn't inherently strange for him to leave me notes. Our house was built on a foundation of post, its reminders to take the trash out to the curb, grocery requests, quick scribbles about checking the oil in my car. But this artifact felt entirely different. It wasn't a casual sticky note slapped onto the fridge. The envelope was sealed tight. I stood paralyzed at the island for what felt like an eternity, staring down at the paper rectangle, engaged in a fierce internal debate. Part of me screamed to throw it directly into the trash compactor, to refuse whatever reality was waiting inside. I should have listened to that voice. Instead, my morbid curiosity won. I picked it up. My hands were trembling slightly as I slid my fingernail under the adhesive flap, tearing it open and extracting the single, neatly folded sheet of notebook paper. I unfolded it with agonizing slowness. "My darling," the letter began. Every muscle in my body seized. My eyes darted across the subsequent lines, the sound of my own pulse roaring so loudly in my ears, it felt like a physical drumbeat. For a long time, I've been carrying something I don't know how to say out loud. Watching you grow up has been the most beautiful and the most agonizingly painful thing I've ever experienced in my life. Beautiful, because you've blossomed into someone so incredibly extraordinary. Painful, because I've had to force myself to ignore feelings I never in a million years expected to have. My lungs seemingly forgot how to draw in oxygen. This isn't something I am proud of, but it is something I simply can't deny to myself anymore. I've tried everything to bury it, to convince myself it was just a passing phase that would eventually fade. But it hasn't. If anything, the harder I fight it, the stronger it grows. The paper was rattling violently now, betraying the severe tremor in my hands. I know this changes everything between us. I know it might ruin everything we have. But I couldn't keep pretending, not when you are right here, walking through this house every single day, and I feel like I am slowly losing my mind trying to act like I don't see you the way that I do. I dropped the paper onto the cold granite as if it had burst into flames, The kitchen suddenly felt like it was tilting on its axis. The edges of my vision blurring. No, 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 no. This was a nightmare. This couldn't be my actual reality. Daniel wouldn't do this. He couldn't do this. The heavy thud of the front door opening shattered the silence. I flinched violently, my heart leaping into my throat like a trapped bird. "Hey, I am home!" His voice echoed from the foyer. I remained rooted to the spot, completely frozen, staring down at the damning piece of paper as if sheer willpower could make it disintegrate. His heavy footsteps approached the kitchen, slow and deliberate. "Did you happen to see?" He stopped dead in his tracks the moment he crossed the threshold. He saw me, he saw the unfolded letter on the counter. He saw the sheer, unadulterated horror painted across my face. For a terrifying, stretched out second, neither of us breathed. The silence was a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Then, he let out a long, shuddering exhale, looking exactly like a man who had just willingly stepped off the edge of a skyscraper and suddenly realized gravity was unforgiving. "I guess you read it," he said, his voice stripped of all its usual resonance. I couldn't formulate a word. My brain was short-circuiting. All I could process was a violently swirling cocktail of shock, visceral disgust, burning anger, and a darker, more terrifying emotion I absolutely refused to name. "Please say something," he added, a pathetic, pleading edge bleeding into his tone. When I finally managed to locate my voice, it emerged sharper and more jagged than I intended. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He physically recoiled as if I had struck him across the face. I know exactly how it sounds." "It sounds exactly like what it is," I practically shouted. The dam finally breaking. "You are my stepfather." "I know." He fired back rapidly, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. I know. "Then why in God's name would you write something like this?" I demanded. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides, shaking with pure adrenaline. "Why would you ever think it was okay to put this out there?" "I never said it was okay," he snapped, a flash of defensiveness rising before he immediately crushed it down, his expression softening into misery. "I said I couldn't ignore it anymore. It was eating me alive. That doesn't make it any better. I just needed you to know," he pleaded, taking a half step forward. "I couldn't live a lie anymore. I needed to be honest with you." "Honest?" I let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed unpleasantly off the tile. "You think this is honesty? This is delusion. You've been living under the same roof as me, acting like my parent, eating dinner with my mother, and this sick fantasy is what has been running through your head." His jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. I never acted on it, not once. "Oh, congratulations," I spat, the sarcasm dripping like venom. "Do you want a medal for basic human decency? Should we throw you a parade?" He ran a hand aggressively through his hair, a nervous habit I had seen a million times, but now it just made my skin crawl. "I am not asking for a parade. I am not asking for anything from you. I am not expecting you to reciprocate. You wrote." "My darling," I interrupted, my voice cracking as the volume rose. "That is not nothing. That is a massive, unforgivable something." He fell completely silent, and in that heavy, oppressive quiet, the reality of the situation solidified. The ground permanently shifted beneath my feet. Because looking at him then, stripped of his paternal disguise, I saw the terrifying truth. This wasn't a fleeting moment of weakness. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a deep, entrenched obsession he had been cultivating for years. And now that he had unleashed it into the air, there was absolutely no way to cram it back into the box. I took a deliberate step backward, maximizing the physical distance between us. "I need you to stay as far away from me as humanly possible," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy calm. His eyes widened slightly, his expression tightening. I live in this house too. Then figure it out, I countered ruthlessly. Because I am not going to walk around this house pretending this disgusting conversation never happened. His eyes roamed desperately over my face, searching for a lifeline. He was looking for a shred of empathy, maybe a hint of understanding, or some miraculous well of forgiveness. He was going to find absolutely nothing. The well was poisoned. I spun around and marched out of the kitchen, my chest tight to the point of pain, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. But even as I slammed my bedroom door shut behind me, violently twisting the lock with trembling fingers, a parasitic thought began to burrow into my brain, refusing to be dislodged no matter how hard I tried to shake it. If this horrific fixation had been building up inside him for years, how much of it had I completely missed? And more terrifyingly, how much further was he willing to push the boundaries now that the secret was finally out in the open? Sleep was a biological impossibility that night. I lay rigid on top of my comforter, staring blankly at the shadows dancing across the ceiling. My phone gripped in my hand like a distress beacon. I didn't know who to send to. Every time my eyelids fluttered shut, the cursive text of that letter burned itself into the backs of my retinas. The words didn't remain static, they morphed, replayed in his voice, and twisted themselves into something increasingly sinister the longer I dwelled on them. My darling, what kind of twisted man writes that? Not a father figure, not a stepfather. Not the man who watched me struggle with middle school algebra. Not the man who sat in the background of every major developmental milestone of my life. Perfectly disguised as something safe and protective. Sometime deep in the dead of the night, right around 3 a.m, the profound silence of the house was broken. I heard the distinct, muted groan of the floorboards in the hallway. Slow, agonizingly careful footsteps. My entire body went completely rigid. I stopped breathing without even realizing I was holding my breath. The heavy footsteps stopped directly outside my bedroom door. For a second, one long, agonizing, suffocating second. I was terrified he was going to turn the knob. Or worse, knock. He didn't, but I knew with absolute certainty that he was standing there. I could practically feel the heat of his presence radiating through the cheap hollow, core wood of the door. It felt like he was locked in a fierce internal debate, like he desperately wanted to whisper an apology through the crack. Or take it all back, or God forbid, escalate the nightmare even further. After what felt like an eternity, the floorboards creaked again, and the footsteps slowly retreated down the hall. I exhaled so violently that my chest physically ached. That was the precise moment the illusion fully shattered. This wasn't merely an uncomfortable family dynamic anymore. This wasn't an awkward misunderstanding I could shove under the rug and pray would dissipate. The structural integrity of my home had been permanently compromised. The following morning possessed a surreal, dreamlike quality, as if I had somehow woken up in an alternate dimension that looked identical to my own but operated on a fundamentally hostile set of rules. I remained holed up in my bedroom for as long as humanly possible, straining my ears for any auditory clue that he was still in the house. When I finally heard the mechanical rumble of the garage door opening and the familiar hum of his car engine pulling out into the street, I forced myself to wait an agonizing 10 additional minutes just to ensure it wasn't a trick. Only then did I unlock my door and venture out. The house looked disgustingly normal. Bright, cheerful sunlight poured through the kitchen bay windows. The coffee pot on the counter was still radiating a comforting warmth, and a single cereal bowl was left soaking in the sink. It was the epitome of domestic tranquility. It was sickening. I gravitated toward the granite island where the letter had ignited my world the day before. It was gone. Erased from the scene. Of course it was. I stood in the center of the kitchen, hugging my arms tightly across my chest, utterly paralyzed by indecision. What was the protocol here? Do I call my mother and blow up her entire reality? Do I pack a duffel bag, drain my meager savings, and disappear? Every conceivable option felt like detonating a different kind of bomb. If I told her the truth, it would be a catastrophic explosion. It would obliterate their marriage, shatter her heart, and destroy whatever fragile semblance of a family unit we had left. if I swallowed the secret and stayed quiet. I didn't even know what kind of psychological torture that entailed. Right around noon, my phone violently vibrated against the counter. His name illuminated the screen. Daniel. I stared at the glowing rectangle as if it were a live grenade. The message preview scrolled across the glass. Can we please talk? The tight knot in my chest pulled tighter. I didn't touch the phone. 60 seconds later, a second message appeared. I am so incredibly sorry about how that came out. The phrasing was absurd. He was framing it as if he had poorly phrased a benign compliment, not dropped a nuclear confession of inappropriate obsession. I furiously typed out a scathing, expletive-laden reply, stared at it, and then held the backspace key until it vanished. I typed another response, deleted it again. Finally, I hit the power button, throwing the phone onto the couch. I couldn't engage with him. Not right now. Maybe not for the rest of my life. But burying my head in the sand wasn't a sustainable strategy either. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long bruised shadows across the living room, my anxiety had mutated into something sharp and manic. I couldn't sit in one place for more than a minute. My brain kept flashing forward to my mother. She would be walking through that front door in a matter of hours, exhausted from her trip, entirely oblivious to the fact that her sanctuary had been violated. How was I supposed to look her in the eye and ask about her trip? How was I supposed to sit across from her at the dinner table and swallow this massive poisonous lie? The sudden, grinding noise of the garage door mechanism engaging snapped me out of my spiral. My heart instantly skyrocketed to a dangerous tempo. I hadn't realized how violently tense my muscles were until that exact moment. It was his car he had returned. I stood dead center in the living room, a deer caught in the headlights, as the door leading from the garage swung open, and he stepped into the house. For a long, agonizing beat, neither of us moved a muscle. He looked completely wrecked. The bags under his eyes were prominent. His shoulders slumped as if he hadn't slept a wink either. His eyes locked onto mine, and a heavy, suffocating, entirely unspoken dialogue passed between us in the silence. "I texted you," he said, his voice barely rising above a murmur. "I saw." The silence returned heavier than before. He reached back and pushed the door closed with agonizing slowness, as if any sudden movement might cause me to bolt out the front door. "We really need to talk about this," he said. I shook my head violently, stepping back. No, we don't." "Yes, we do," he insisted. Taking a cautious step forward, I took another rapid step back, putting the coffee table between us. "Don't," I ordered. My voice sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. "Just don't take another step closer to me." He froze instantly, throwing his hands up in surrender. "Okay. I am stopping. Good." He let out a ragged sigh, running his hand through his hair again in that telltale nervous gesture. "Look. I know this is a massive shock. I know I completely bungled this by dropping it on you in a letter like some kind of coward. You bungled it by allowing the thought to exist in your brain in the first place," I fired back, my voice trembling with rage. His jaw locked tight, but he swallowed his pride and didn't argue the point. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen," he pleaded. "Do you honestly think this is what I wanted?" "I don't give a damn what you wanted," I shouted, the volume echoing painfully in the quiet house. "You are supposed to be the adult in this dynamic." "I am the adult," he shot back, his voice rising to match mine before he visibly forced himself to dial it down. "That is exactly why I never laid a finger on you. Stop weaponizing your basic self-control, like it suddenly makes you a righteous person." A complex flurry of emotions flickered across his face: frustration, deep-seated guilt, and a terrifying kind of desperation. It was getting impossible to read him. "I am just trying to be radically honest with you," he said, his voice cracking. "Why?" I demanded, throwing my hands up in exasperation. "Why right now? Why couldn't you just take this sick little secret to your grave?" Why couldn't you just keep repressing it like you apparently have been for years? He hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but that microscopic pause was a damning confession all on its own. Because it was getting harder, he admitted. The words tasting like ash. I stared at him, my breathing shallow. Harder, I repeated, the word tasting foul in my mouth. He looked at me, really looked at me, stripping away the final layers of pretense. There was nowhere left to hide. The truth was standing naked in the center of the living room. Yeah, he whispered, it was getting impossible. It felt as though a vacuum had sucked all the breathable air out of the room. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest again, physically holding my ribs together to keep my heart from exploding. That is not my problem, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. That is a demon you battle on your own time, away from this house, away from me. I have tried, he pleaded, his voice tinged with agony. Do you think I haven't fought this every single day? I don't care about your struggle, I snapped, entirely devoid of pity. This isn't some Catholic confessional where you dump your sins on me and expect me to grant you absolution and understanding. I am not expecting absolution, he said quickly, desperate to make me understand. I just needed you to finally know where I was at. What my reality was. Why? I asked again, my voice finally cracking under the immense emotional weight. Why did I need to bear the burden of knowing that? He opened his mouth to reply, then snapped it shut. For a fleeting moment he looked genuinely lost, like he had sprinted to the edge of a cliff and realized he didn't actually have a parachute. I thought maybe, he stammered. Then let the sentence die. Maybe, what? I pushed, stepping closer to the coffee table, demanding the rest of the poison. He shook his head vigorously. Forget it. It is stupid, it doesn't matter. No, you don't get to do that, I insisted fiercely. You already nuked our entire lives. You don't get to hold back now. Say it. He looked away, staring at the floorboards. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. I thought maybe you felt a pull too, he confessed softly. The words struck me with the physical force of a slap across the face. What? I gasped, genuine disbelief completely flooding my system. Are you out of your mind right now? I am not explicitly saying that you do, he backpedaled rapidly, looking up in a panic. I am just saying, I am a perceptive guy. I've noticed things over the years. The specific way you look at me sometimes, when you think I am not paying attention, the way you… Stop talking right now, I commanded, my entire body vibrating with blinding fury. Do not dare try to project this sickness onto me. I am not trying to. Yes, you absolutely are, I yelled, pointing an accusing finger at his chest. You are desperately trying to rewrite history to make it sound like I was somehow complicit, like I actively encouraged this twisted fantasy. I never used those words. You didn't have to. I screamed back. The implication is loud and clear. He exhaled a sharp, frustrated breath, running both hands over his face. I am just trying to communicate my perspective. I am telling you what I genuinely felt, what I thought I saw in you, what you hallucinated. I corrected brutally. Another silence descended upon the room. But this iteration felt distinctly different. It was tighter, more volatile, far more dangerous. Because the atmosphere had shifted. A massive, undeniable line had been obliterated, and it wasn't just his crossing of it that terrified me. It was the sudden realization that we were now operating in uncharted, lawless territory. I think you need to pack a bag and leave, I said, the finality in my voice surprising even me. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock. What? Leave, I repeated, pointing toward the front door. Go to a hotel for a few days, a week, I don't care, but you cannot sleep under this roof tonight. This is my home too, he protested, though the argument lacked any real conviction. "And I no longer feel safe breathing the same air as you," I replied evenly. That specific phrasing hit its target. I watched the realization physically land on him. I saw the way his defensive posture completely collapsed, the way his broad shoulders slumped in defeat. "I would never ever lay a hand on you to hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't say you were going to assault me," I clarified coldly. "But that doesn't mean I am psychologically comfortable sharing a living space with you after you just blew up our family." He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbing, he nodded slowly, accepting the sentence. "Okay," he murmured after a long pause. "Okay." He turned and slowly walked to the front foyer, grabbing his keyring off the console table. His movements were lethargic now, heavily weighed down by the reality of his exile. "I'll go check into the Marriott off the highway," he offered into the silence. I refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. He paused with his hand resting on the brass door handle, his back to me. "For whatever it is worth to you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, refusing to turn around. "I meant every single word I wrote in that letter. Even if it makes you hate my guts for the rest of your life." A complex, agonizing knot twisted violently in the center of my chest. It was a miserable tangle of profound anger, visceral disgust, and an incredibly unsettling confusion I couldn't untangle. "Good," I spat at his back, "because I honestly don't know what other emotion I am supposed to feel toward you right now." He nodded once, a sharp jerk of his head, before opening the heavy oak door and walking out into the fading daylight. The hollow thud of the door pulling shut echoed through the empty foyer. And just like that, the house was entirely mine. But the isolation didn't usher in the wave of relief I was desperately anticipating. It felt exactly like the eerie pressurized calm that blankets a city right before a Category 5 hurricane makes landfall. Because while I had achieved physical distance, that distance had created a terrifying vacuum. It created space for his horrific words to truly sink their claws into my brain. It created a quiet arena for me to begin questioning things I had spent years meticulously avoiding. And as much as I violently hated myself for it, one insidious thought kept creeping back under the door of my consciousness, no matter how many mental barricades I erected to keep it out. What exactly did he mean when he said he had noticed things, and why did the prospect of answering that specific question terrify me more than his entire confession? The house felt fundamentally wrong without his presence. That was the first deeply unsettling realization that hit me after he'd been banished for 48 hours. I loathed myself for even allowing the thought to form. It absolutely wasn't that I missed his company, not in a romantic or even a familial sense. It was simply that the entire acoustic rhythm of the house had been violently disrupted. The silence wasn't a peaceful, restorative quiet anymore. It was oppressive. It was heavy. Every single room felt like it was holding its breath. It felt as though the drywall itself had absorbed his confession and was silently demanding that I process the fallout. I tried to construct a fortress of distractions. I spent hours at the campus library pretending to highlight textbooks. I sat in crowded coffee shops until the baristas started glaring at me to leave. I even drove aimlessly down endless stretches of suburban highway just to delay returning to the quiet house. But no matter how fast I ran, the haunting specter of that conversation always beat me home. His gravelly voice, the precise cadence of his words, that intense, dark look in his eyes, and that one looping, inescapable sentence. "I've noticed things." It played on a continuous loop in my cerebral cortex, like a scratched vinyl record. Initially, I aggressively categorized the statement as classic textbook manipulation. It was a pathetic, desperate tactic to shift the burden of guilt. A calculated move to make me question my own sanity and reality. That logical explanation made perfect sense. It was the easiest, safest pill to swallow. But the deeper I descended into my own head, the more agonizingly uncomfortable the internal monologue became, because against my own will, my brain began forcibly excavating memories. I started reviewing the tape of my own life, analyzing moments that had seemed entirely innocuous at the time, Or, more accurately, moments I had aggressively convinced myself were innocuous. I thought about the times I would casually catch him staring at me from across the room, and how I had quickly dismissed it as paternal daydreaming. I thought about the countless evenings we'd watch movies, and how I'd sit just a fraction too close to him on the sectional, because the proximity felt warm and familiar because it had always been our normal. I thought about the casual, incidental physical contact, his large hand resting firmly on my shoulder as he walked past. The friction of my arm brushing against his chest when we navigated the tight space between the stove and the island. None of those microscopic interactions had ever triggered alarm bells before. So why, looking back through this newly tainted lens, did every single memory feel electric and vaguely forbidden? I stood shivering in front of the master bathroom mirror late on the third night, aggressively staring at my own tired reflection until my features blurred, and I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I tried to look at myself objectively, trying desperately to see what he saw. And I hated that inquiry infinitely more than I hated the terrifying possibilities of the answer. My phone buzzed on the porcelain vanity top Daniel. I had successfully ignored a half-dozen texts over the past 2 days. He hadn't been aggressive in his outreach, just a smattering of brief check-ins. Are you doing okay? Is there any chance we can talk today? Nothing demanding. Nothing that provided me with the easy, clean excuse to permanently block his number and wash my hands of the situation entirely. This new notification, however, caused the blood to freeze in my veins. Your mother just texted. She is asking why I am not at the house. My chest instantly contracted in a violent spasm. My mother. I had been so drowning in my own psychological horror show, so entirely consumed by my own internal crisis, that I had completely pushed her impending return out of my mind. She was the collateral damage in all of this, and she was currently cruising at 30,000 feet, entirely ignorant of the fact that her life had been blown to pieces. A second text chimed through before I could even formulate a thought. I told her I was on a work trip. I don't think she believes me. I sank down onto the cold tile floor of the bathroom, pulling my knees to my chest, my mind spinning violently out of control. This was the exact crucible I had been dreading. I couldn't keep this toxic spill contained indefinitely. The timeline had accelerated. I was standing at a horrific fork in the road. I either blow the whistle and destroy her reality, or I become an active accomplice in his massive deception. Both paths led off a terrifying precipice. I typed out a furious reply, then aggressively deleted it, typed another, erased it. Finally, my trembling thumbs hammered out a single definitive directive. Come back to the house tomorrow morning. We will figure out a story. The response from his end was instantaneous. Okay, that single word was infuriating. There was no pushback, no argument, no demand for further explanation, and somehow his immediate, unquestioning compliance made the entire situation feel vastly more sinister. The following day moved with the viscosity of molasses. Every passing hour felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't process a single page of my textbooks. My brain was locked in a perpetual state of running simulations. I was trying to map out every possible branch of the upcoming conversation, trying to pre-script my reactions, so I wouldn't completely lose my composure when I saw his face again. By the time I heard the distinct crunch of his tires rolling up the asphalt driveway, my heart was hammering a frantic, erratic beat against my ribs. I anchored myself in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the granite counter so hard my knuckles turned white. When he finally walked through the door, the world seemed to stutter. For one brief, fleeting millisecond, my brain defaulted to its old programming. He was just Daniel, coming home from work. Everything was fine. And then the reality of the letter crashed back down, suffocating me. He physically looked different. It wasn't a change in his wardrobe or his grooming. It was an invisible shift in his aura. He carried himself with the vigilance of a soldier walking through a minefield. He was acutely aware of his own mass, calculating every micro-movement to avoid triggering an explosion. Hey, he said, his voice barely a rasp. I refused to offer an immediate response. I just stood there, my eyes locked on him, studying the enemy. "Hi." I finally managed to produce. The silence rushed back in to fill the void. God. I was developing a profound phobia of the silence. "Her flight lands in 2 hours," he stated, gently placing his keys in the ceramic bowl by the door. "We need to make absolutely sure we are telling the exact same story." I offered a stiff, jerky nod. "Yeah, we do." He stayed rooted near the doorway, visually sweeping my face as if searching for a hidden trap. "Are you holding up okay?" he asked softly. The audacity of the question nearly caused me to laugh hysterically. "No," I replied, my voice completely deadened. "I am not doing great, surprisingly." He nodded, absorbing the blow, accepting that he deserved it. "I really didn't mean to." "Stop," I ordered, slicing my hand through the air. "Please, for the love of God, do not start reading from that script again." He snapped his mouth shut instantly. "Okay, understood." We remained locked in our positions, separated by 10 feet of hardwood floor that suddenly felt like a massive, uncrossable chasm. "So what exactly is the narrative we are feeding her?" he asked quietly. I took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to force my brain to operate pragmatically. "We aren't telling her a damn thing about what actually happened," I declared. His brow furrowed slightly in surprise. "Are you entirely sure about that?" "No," I confessed bitterly. "I am not sure about anything anymore. But I fail to see how dropping a nuclear bomb on her right now accomplishes anything productive." "Yes, it would be the truth, but it would completely obliterate her life," I snapped, glaring at him. "There is a massive difference between honesty and destruction." He didn't offer a single word of rebuttal. "She currently thinks you are dealing with a massive crisis at work." I continued, outlining the battle plan. "So, that is exactly what we are going with. There was an emergency at the office. You needed absolute focus, so you booked a hotel for a few days to work through the night. End of story. No further details." "And what about us?" he asked, the question hanging heavy and dangerous in the air. I glared at him, a fresh wave of anger cresting in my chest. "There is no us, Daniel," I stated emphatically. "There never was, and there never will be." A microscopic flinch registered in his eyes, a flicker of genuine pain, but he didn't push against the boundary. "Right, got it," he murmured. Another heavy silence descended, but this iteration felt different than the tense quiet of the past few days. It wasn't just awkwardness or residual anger. It was intensely, terrifyingly charged, because the secret was no longer contained to a piece of paper. It was a living, breathing entity occupying the space between us. It was out in the open, undeniable, and entirely impossible to ignore. "I just want you to know. I meant what I said," he added softly, unable to let it go. I squeezed my eyes shut, a headache beginning to throb behind my temples. I demanded, my voice cracking. "What exactly do you expect me to do with that information?" "Nothing," he admitted, looking down at his shoes. "I don't know. I needed you to understand that it wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It wasn't a mistake." I let out a sharp, incredulous breath. "That actively makes the situation 10 times worse, Daniel." "I know," he replied. But the inflection in his voice was chilling. It didn't sound like a man drowning in regret. It sounded like a man who had finally surrendered to a truth he had been fighting for years, and that quiet acceptance terrified me more than anything he had done so far. Before I could launch into another tirade, the loud clatter of the front door unlocking echoed through the house. My mother's voice, bright, chipper, and horribly familiar, rang out. "Hello, are my favorite people home?" My stomach completely gave out. "We're in the kitchen," I called out, violently forcing a cheerful cadence into my tone that I absolutely did not feel. She bustled into the room a second later, dragging a small carry-on suitcase, her face breaking into a wide smile as she looked between the two of us. "There you guys are," she said, immediately dropping the handle and walking toward Daniel. What on earth has been going on with you? You've been totally Mia on the phone. He didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. The lie slid off his tongue with terrifying ease. Massive supply chain issues at work. He lied smoothly, moving to intercept her for a hug. It was a total nightmare. I had to lock myself in a hotel room for 3 days just to put the fires out without any distractions. She pulled back from the embrace, studying his tired face for a moment before letting out a sympathetic sigh. Honey, you could have just told me it was a work emergency instead of being so cryptic. I know, he murmured, kissing her forehead. I just didn't want to stress you out while you were visiting your sister. She softened instantly, gently resting a hand on his chest. You know I can handle it. I am just glad you are home. I stood anchored to the floorboards, watching this display of domestic affection, a new, entirely different brand of sickness twisting in my gut. It was pure, unadulterated guilt. She loved him, she trusted him implicitly, and I was standing 3 feet away, actively participating in a massive conspiracy to pull the wool over her eyes. Are you feeling all right, sweetie? She asked, pivoting her attention to me. Her maternal radar detecting the tension, I blinked rapidly, caught completely off guard. Oh yeah, fine, just really exhausted, stressing over midterms. She surmised with a knowing smile. Yeah, exactly that. I lied, the word tasting like bile. She walked over and squeezed my shoulder warmly. You work too hard. You are going to ace them. If she only possessed the slightest clue of what was actually happening under her roof. Dinner that evening was an exercise in psychological torture. It felt less like a meal and more like a high-stakes theatrical performance. We all gathered around the dining room table in our assigned seats, exactly as we had done 1,000 times before. We engaged in perfectly normal, mundane conversation. We laughed at appropriate intervals, to a completely blind observer peering through the window. We were the picture, perfect American family. But beneath the thin veneer of normalcy, a terrifying current was running. Every casual glance across the table felt loaded with subtext. Every pause in the conversation felt intentional and heavy. At one excruciating point during the meal, Daniel reached across the table for the salt shaker at the exact millisecond I did. Our fingers collided. It was barely a brush of skin against skin, but it felt like grabbing a live wire. I yanked my hand back so violently, I nearly knocked over my water glass. Neither of us acknowledged it verbally. My mother kept right on talking about her sister's new patio furniture. But I felt the shockwave of the contact, and judging by the sudden tightness in his jaw, I knew he felt it too. Hours later, the house plunged into darkness. My mother had retired to the master bedroom, exhausted from her travel. I found myself pacing the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway, hovering directly outside the closed door of the guest bedroom where Daniel had agreed to sleep for the foreseeable future. I genuinely have no recollection of making the conscious decision to walk to his door. My heart was thumping a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs. My internal monologue was screaming at me. This is a catastrophic mistake. Turn around. Go back to your room. I knew with absolute certainty that engaging with him late at night was playing with fire, but my knuckles rapped against the painted wood anyway. Less than 3 seconds later, the door swung inward. He was still fully dressed, looking entirely unsurprised, yet deeply shocked to see me standing there in the dim light. Hey! I swallowed a massive lump of anxiety. We need to establish hard boundaries, I whispered rapidly, the words tumbling out as if stopping to breathe would rob me of my courage. He nodded slowly, keeping his voice equally hushed. Okay, name them. I am entirely serious about this, I continued, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound authoritative. No more cryptic letters. No more lingering looks across the room. No more brushing hands at dinner. Absolutely no more of whatever this sick dynamic is. All right, he agreed simply. And if you find yourself incapable of adhering to those rules, I pushed, staring fiercely into his eyes, Then you need to pack your things and leave this house permanently. I mean it this time. He held my gaze, the intensity in his eyes burning hot in the shadowy hallway. I can do that, he stated softly. I intensely analyzed his expression, desperate to find a tell, to see if he was simply placating me, or if he genuinely intended to bury his obsession. I couldn't crack his code. Good, I whispered. I pivoted on my heel to retreat to the safety of my room. Wait, he called out. His voice a gravelly whisper. I froze, my back facing him. What? I asked, refusing to turn around. A heavy pregnant pause stretched out behind me, then quieter, more intimate. If you just wanted to lay down rules, why did you walk all the way over to my door in the middle of the night instead of just sending a text? The question acted like a physical blow. It caught me entirely off guard, shattering my defensive posture. I hesitated, my mind scrambling for a logical, sterile excuse. I don't know. I lied finally. But it was a spectacular lie, because buried deep down in the darkest, most heavily fortified vault of my subconscious, there was a reason, a deeply terrifying, incredibly dangerous reason that I absolutely refused to examine under harsh light. I practically ran back to my bedroom, throwing the door shut and leaning heavily against the wood as my heart threatened to hammer its way out of my chest. The tectonic plates of my reality were shifting again, and this time, I was slowly waking up to the horrifying realization that I couldn't comfortably pin all the blame on his shoulders. I desperately wish I could document that this late night confrontation was the ultimate turning point. I wish I could say that the boundaries were established. He respected the invisible fences, and we miraculously navigated our way back to the comfortable platonic dynamic we had enjoyed for a decade. But there was absolutely nothing normal about our existence anymore. Not the oppressive atmosphere of the house, not the terrifying silence, and certainly not the way my own thoughts constantly, traitorously circled back to the very concepts I was desperately trying to repress. For the next 2 weeks, he executed my demands with military precision. He maintained a massive physical distance. There were no lingering glances, no unnecessary small talk, no accidental brushes in the hallway. If anything, his demeanor transformed into something cold, clinical, and overly polite, as if he were actively trying to perform a lobotomy on his own feelings and erase any evidence of the man who had written that letter. Logically, I should have felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The threat had been neutralized. Instead, I felt a deep gnawing sense of unease. Because the underlying tension hadn't evaporated. It had simply changed states. It had mutated from an external threat into an internal pressure cooker. I found myself increasingly aware of the absence of his attention. It was a horrifying realization. I noticed the void left behind when he stopped casually asking about my classes. I felt the empty space in the kitchen when he no longer hovered near the island while I made coffee. The comfortable, effortless familiarity that had defined our relationship had been eradicated, replaced by a hyper, calculated, aggressively safe sterility. And for some deeply twisted, incomprehensible reason, that suffocating safety felt infinitely worse than the danger. I began actively avoiding being alone in any room with him. It wasn't because I feared he would suddenly snap and cross a physical boundary. I actually believed him when he swore he had the willpower to control his actions. I was avoiding him because I had completely lost faith in my own reactions. That was the hidden variable I hadn't accounted for in my grand equation of boundaries. This nightmare wasn't solely about his inappropriate confession anymore. It was about how his confession acted as a blacklight, illuminating terrifying, hidden stains within my own psyche. It fundamentally altered the way I perceived every interaction. And terrifyingly, how I perceived myself. Another week dragged by in this agonizing stalemate. And then, a new, far more insidious emotion began to take root in the fertile soil of my anxiety. It was quieter than the anger, more subtle than the shock, but infinitely more lethal. It was curiosity. It manifested in microscopic, easily deniable ways. A fleeting thought that I allowed to linger for 3 seconds instead of immediately squashing it. A specific memory from years past that I suddenly found myself replaying from his twisted perspective. And inevitably, the return of that specific haunting question. What exactly did he see when he looked at me? And worse, why did it feel like I was developing a desperate need to find out? I violently despised this emerging facet of my personality. Every time the dark curiosity bubbled to the surface, I tried to mentally bludgeon it back into submission. I would instantly throw on noise, canceling headphones, blast abrasive music, or physically leave the house. I tried everything to drown the thoughts out, but they didn't die. They simply retreated to the shadows and waited patiently. Late one Tuesday night, I returned home from a grueling study session at the library. The house was entirely silent, bathed in the dim amber glow of the hallway nightlights. It was the specific kind of profound stillness that amplifies the sound of your own breathing. I kicked off my sneakers in the mudroom, dropped my heavy backpack onto a chair, and padded silently toward the kitchen, desperate for a cold glass of water. He was already occupying the space. He was leaning casually against the granite counter in the dark. A rocks glass of amber liquid loosely held in his hand, looking out the window into the pitch black backyard as if he had been stationed there for hours. The second I crossed the threshold, we both completely froze, a pair of deer caught in a mutual spotlight. Every instinct screamed at me to perform an immediate about-face and march upstairs. "Hey," he rasped, his voice impossibly careful, testing the ice. I hesitated, my hand gripping the doorframe. Then, driven by some masochistic impulse I couldn't control, I forced myself to walk into the room. "Hey," I moved to the cabinet, pulled down a glass, and filled it from the fridge dispenser, intentionally keeping my gaze locked on the rushing water, refusing to look in his direction. We hadn't been in a room together, just the two of us, this physically close in weeks. "You are home pretty late," he observed quietly. "Yeah," I replied, taking a slow sip of the freezing water. "Group project ran over." He offered a slow nod. Silence immediately rushed in to fill the void. God, I hated the silence, it was deafening. I took another agonizingly slow sip, desperately trying to ignore the way my pulse had suddenly kicked into overdrive, thudding heavily against my eardrums. Then, he shattered the quiet. "I've been strictly following the rules you laid out." I kept my eyes glued to the glass in my hand. "I know you have. I meant what I said," he continued, taking a step toward the center of the kitchen. "About respecting your boundaries." "I know," I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. Another suffocating pause stretched between us. "I haven't looked at you with those intentions," he stated, sounding as though he needed to physically speak the words to make them true. Something about the strained, desperate quality of that admission caused my chest to constrict violently. "Okay," I managed to say, "but that absolutely does not mean the feeling is gone," he confessed, the words dropping like lead weights onto the tile floor. There it was. The ugly, terrifying truth dragged back out into the open. I squeezed my eyes shut, exhaling a long, trembling breath. "Why are you telling me this right now?" I pleaded. "Because I refuse to let you think I am just pretending none of this happened," he said, his voice gaining traction. "I am actively, forcefully controlling it. There is a massive psychological difference." I slowly turned my head to finally face him. "Do you even hear how insane that sounds?" I asked. My voice laced with disbelief. "Yeah," he admitted without hesitation. "I absolutely do, and I am still choosing to say it to you," he replied, his gaze locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. We stood perfectly still in the dim kitchen, staring across the expanse of the island, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I didn't immediately break eye contact. I didn't run away. I don't know exactly why. Perhaps I was simply exhausted from the constant psychological sprinting. Perhaps a twisted part of me wanted to stubbornly prove that his gaze held no power over me. Or maybe, God forbid, I just desperately wanted to look at it clearly, without the filter of shock. Whatever the subconscious motivation, I held his stare, and in that terrifying, extended moment of connection, a massive internal shift occurred. The change didn't happen within him, it happened entirely within me. Because looking at him then, I didn't just see the horrific, inappropriate desire he had confessed to. I saw the massive, excruciating restraint operating behind it. I saw the immense toll it was taking on him to hold the dam together. I saw the way his knuckles were white around his glass, the way his jaw was clamped shut, the way his entire physical form was vibrating with the effort of remaining on his side of the invisible line, and for some horrific, unexplainable reason, seeing his agony made the situation infinitely worse, because it humanized the monster. "You really need to go to sleep," I said finally, my voice dropping to a fragile whisper. "Yeah," he agreed immediately, but his feet remained firmly planted to the floor. The seconds ticked by, heavy and loaded. Finally, he pushed himself away from the counter. He walked toward the doorway, his path bringing him within inches of where I was standing. He was close enough that I could smell the sharp tang of bourbon on his breath and feel the ambient heat radiating off his body. He stopped, right next to me. He didn't reach out. He didn't cross any physical boundary. He didn't execute a single inappropriate action. He was just there, existing in my immediate orbit. The gravitational pull was terrifying. "Good night," he murmured, the words vibrating in the narrow space between us. "Good night," I breathed back, completely paralyzed. He walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. I remained frozen against the cabinets, my heart racing at a dangerous, entirely unjustifiable speed, terrified by the realization of how badly I had wanted him to close that final inch. That night, my bedroom felt like a prison cell. I didn't even attempt to sleep. I paced from the window to the closet, back to the window, over and over. My brain felt like it was trapped in a centrifuge. This was fundamentally, objectively wrong. Every single angle of this dynamic was diseased. I knew that with absolute crystalline certainty, but possessing the intellectual knowledge of its wrongness did absolutely nothing to erase the visceral reality of what was happening. It merely added layers of crushing guilt to the agonizing confusion. At some point deep in the night, I found myself standing in the upstairs hallway again. I stopped directly outside his bedroom door, entirely mirroring my actions from weeks prior. Only this time, I didn't immediately raise my knuckles to the wood. I stood paralyzed in the dark, staring blankly at the grain of the door, my right hand hovering suspended just inches away from knocking. My internal monologue was a chaotic battlefield. Logic screamed at me to pivot, to walk back to the safety of my room, to lock the door and never speak of this again. That was the clear, obvious, surviving choice. The choice that preserved my family, my sanity, and my future. The choice that didn't lead down a dark, destructive, point of no return path, but my hand actively refused the command to retreat. Instead, I knocked. It was a soft, barely perceptible tap, a coward's knock. The door opened instantly, as if he had been standing right on the other side, waiting. He looked just as wrecked, just as surprised, and just as trapped as the last time. "Hey!" I swallowed dryly. For a long, terrifying second, my vocal cords refused to operate. Then, a broken whisper. "I don't understand any of this." He didn't attempt to play dumb. He didn't ask me to clarify. "I know." He breathed heavily. "No." I shook my head violently, tears of sheer frustration finally threatening to spill over. "I mean, I don't understand why it feels like this. Why isn't it just black and white? Why isn't it just easy to hate you?" He leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, his eyes raking over my distressed face. "It is black and white," he countered softly. "You just hate the actual answer." "Which is what?" I challenged, desperate for him to fix the chaos he had initiated. He hesitated, closing his eyes for a brief moment before delivering the fatal blow. That deep, visceral feelings rarely give a damn about the invisible lines society draws. I let out a ragged, shaky breath, dragging a hand through my hair. "That is a terrible excuse. That isn't good enough." "It is not an excuse," he stated firmly. "It is just the terrifying truth." Silence fell over the hallway again. But this specific silence was entirely new. It wasn't fueled by anger, or tension, or boundaries. It was something vastly deeper, darker. It was a silence that made it physically difficult to draw oxygen into my lungs. "I meant what I said too," I confessed. The words rushing out of my mouth before my rational brain could deploy the emergency brakes. His posture shifted instantly, a subtle tightening of his core. "About what exactly?" "About the boundaries," I rambled quickly, trying desperately to backtrack and cover my exposed flank. "About everything," I demanded. "I meant all of it." "I know you did," he said, his voice incredibly gentle, but he intentionally let the sentence drift off into the shadows. "But what?" I demanded, my heart pounding relentlessly. I looked up at him. I really truly looked at him, and in that suffocatingly quiet hallway, the final, terrifying realization locked into place. I couldn't run from it anymore. I couldn't hide behind my righteous anger or my meticulously constructed boundaries. This catastrophic mess wasn't solely his burden to carry anymore. Somewhere along this twisted journey, buried beneath the anger, the confusion, and the thousands of things left unsaid in the dark, the sickness had infected me too. The gravity had caught me, and that realization was the most terrifying thing I had ever experienced. "But," I finally whispered, my voice breaking on the single syllable, "it is just not as simple as it is supposed to be." He didn't offer a verbal response. He didn't need to, because in that moment, our shared understanding was absolute. We were both standing in the wreckage, fully aware of the disaster. A long, agonizing pause stretched taut between us, a physical cord pulling us together while simultaneously holding us apart. Then, very slowly, he straightened his posture, deliberately pulling himself back from the edge, stepping deeper into the shadows of his room. "You really need to go back to bed," he said, his voice laced with an agonizing amount of restraint. I nodded slowly, feeling numb. "Yeah," but my feet remained anchored to the floorboards, and he made absolutely no move to close the door. We simply remained there, locked in orbit, standing on opposite sides of a massive glowing boundary line that we both acutely knew we couldn't cross. We didn't cross it, but we both refused to turn our backs and walk away from it either. And standing there in the dim light, the crushing weight of the future finally settled onto my shoulders. This nightmare wasn't over. It hadn't even truly begun, because the most excruciating part of this entire ordeal wasn't the confession in the letter, or the explosive arguments, or the late-night admissions. The hardest part was what came tomorrow, the reality of waking up and having to live with it every single day. Navigating the same hallways, breathing the same air, enduring the exact same suffocating silence, and knowing deep in my bones that the massive, dangerous question hanging between us would remain perpetually unanswered. Exactly how long can a fire burn behind a closed door before it finally consumes the entire house?